to the Power of One. Today, I am so excited to be speaking with Dr. Jonah about a very interesting topic: recognizing and preventing abuse and neglect of homeschooling children, something I never thought about. Welcome to the show, Dr. Jonah.
Thank you so much for having me, Melanie. Really excited for our conversation.
I am too. I actually homeschooled my two babies. Look, I still call them babies. I have a 28-year-old. He's married, has three babies, my three amazing grandbabies, and my 30-year-old. But I actually homeschooled my children for the first 4 years. But I had the pleasure of taking a training by you, and that never crossed my mind. So it's a coalition of responsible home education. Is that right?
That's right. Yep.
Okay. Tell me when and why that agency was created.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that question. So CRHE, the Coalition for Responsible Home Education, it's a mouthful, so we just go by CRHE. But our mission is to fight to ensure that every homeschool child receives a quality education in a safe home. We were founded in 2013, and since then, we've been doing a lot. We conduct novel research into outcomes, particularly as it pertains to abuse and neglect in homeschool settings, which I'm sure we're going to get into. We create resources for homeschool alumni and for families. We educate the public, and we push for a policy agenda of stronger oversight and stronger protections for homeschooled children. We are actually currently the only nonprofit in the homeschool space that operates explicitly from a children's rights perspective. And there's actually a reason for this. The reason we have that perspective is because our team is essentially almost exclusively run by people who are homeschooled themselves, homeschool alumni. And that includes myself. I was homeschooled through 8th grade and ended up attending public high school after that. And, in our team, Melanie, there's a pretty wide array of experiences. Some people had negative experiences, but some people had really positive experiences. And one thing that I always like to make very clear about CRHE is that we are not anti-homeschooling. In fact, the opposite. We are pro-responsible homeschooling. We have people in our network, people who themselves benefited from the unique experiences and the unique benefits that a homeschool education can provide. And we want to ensure that those benefits are there for all homeschool children. And because of our position as homeschool alumni, we also see, and we are also very aware from a personal kind of firsthand perspective of loopholes in homeschooling law that can allow kids to fall through the cracks. And so that's why we push for stronger safeguards while also preserving all that is good about homeschooling. And there really is a lot.
And you know what I thought about in taking that training? It immediately reminded me of domestic violence, which it is a form of, and especially working with a nonprofit and working with those affected by crime and a lot of domestic violence victims during COVID, when the domestic violence, the incidents just rose because the abuser and abusee are they're literally stuck in the house together. And then thinking about this, I'm thinking about those poor children. So did you see with your research that children who are neglected in the home, that their parents homeschool them?
I mean, abuse and neglect can happen, of course, regardless of school status. But something that's really interesting in terms of COVID is that what happened during COVID is, a massive onslaught of social isolation. And we know from, a very big body of research at this point that social isolation is a risk factor for abuse, both in terms of perpetration, because perpetrators are isolated from resources that might be protective. There's a study that showed that parents reported having a shorter fuse with their children when they were kind of in a context of social isolation, kind of separated from their communities. And also in terms of victimization, of course, and that's exactly what you were saying, when a victim is socially isolated, when they're kind of confined to that home environment, they don't have much recourse as far as getting away from the abuse. And also they don't have access to communities and resources that might be helpful. And so that is something that we definitely look at. And with homeschooling, and I'll give this caveat, it's really difficult in terms of data. We don't even have a reliable number as far as how many homeschooled children there are in the US. And that is because not every state keeps track of its homeschooled children. There are 11 states in which caregivers don't even have to notify the superintendent of the school district or the Department of Education if they're homeschooling. Those states, homeschooling is
Really?
fully, yeah, 11 states. And there are states now that are actually pushing to further deregulate and kind of join that category. And so it's really difficult whenever somebody asks me, oh, well, can we, make a comparison between, homeschooled children and abuse, versus experiences of abuse among, kids who are conventionally schooled. We can't always answer that definitively. We do know that abuse occurs, certainly, in both contexts, and that the risk factors and the patterns can be unique. And that's what we're really interested in looking into. But yes, that you hit the nail on the head there as far as social isolation, why that's like a very profound risk factor. And in homeschool situations, how that might be a little bit exacerbated because those kids might not have a lot of inputs from anything outside of the home.
Why do parents, what are the trends that you see as to why they want to homeschool their children? Like for me, I I wasn't really comfortable with my children going to like um a school. So I'm Philly in
Yeah.
the Philadelphia School District. And I mean, I'm a product of the Philadelphia School District, and I think I turned out amazing. Thanks, mom and dad. But anyway, but you know what I mean? Like, I wanted my children to have a great education. And I will say this, I do not believe that it's realistic to ask a 6-year-old and a 7-year-old and an 8-year-old to just sit in a chair, not talk. And when they talk, they get disciplined. You know what I mean? I don't agree with some of it. I'm more of a
Mhm.
hands-on person, and I am a hands-on learner. But
Right.
and then to penalize. And here's my other thing. Not all children learn the same.
Yep.
So you're going to take little Johnny over here because little Johnny's not learning at the pace that probably 75% of the class is, and then you're going to label little Johnny. I just don't think that's realistic. So for me, I wanted to offer that hands-on education to my children. But what do you see as the trend as to why families homeschool?
Yeah, and I'm really glad that you're framing the conversation this way because I think it's often assumed that, we at CRHE, we push for stronger oversight and stronger, kind of regulation of homeschooling. But that doesn't mean it's a zero-sum game that we can't also identify where public schools fall short. And, saying and, leveraging some critiques around some of the legislation around homeschooling, we're not saying that, oh, public schools are perfect, and that's really important. And so many homeschool families homeschool for the exact reason that you're citing, that their children's needs, their individual learning needs are not easily accommodated in a school environment. That's a lot of children, but particular, children with disabilities, neurodivergent children, homeschooling can really be a very powerful kind of educational method for them better tailored to their needs. That's a big motivation. I said that we don't have, definitive data on homeschooling, but our kind of best source, it comes from the body that does the census. They issue a national household education survey every 4 years, and they look at parental and family involvement in education. And one of the survey questions on there is, motivations. And what we're seeing in terms of trends right now is that the most commonly cited motivation, it's upwards of 80% of families who are citing this, is a concern about school, like safety, the concern about the school environment and their homeschooling in response to those safety concerns.
Mhm,
And,
mhm.
safety is a very broad, what does safety mean, right? Different families might have very different ideas of safety. And I think that, item can accommodate a lot of different perspectives, but that's something that we're really seeing. It's something we're really seeing post-COVID as well. And by the way, post-COVID, homeschooling has experienced a very, very sharp rise, and all
Mhm.
data that we have are indicating that that rise is going to continue.
I believe it. I believe it. Now, and you spoke about some children who have disabilities. So, with that, and some parents that are homeschooling, what are some of the homeschooling oversights?
Yeah, as far as disability goes, I mean, it's at least from an oversight perspective, that is pretty minimal. I mean, oversight on the whole is just I can give you kind of an overview of how we kind of
Mhm.
think about oversight. It's very minimal across the US. Of course, every state regulates homeschooling differently. When you think about the story of homeschooling in the US, it's really a story of the 50 states and the territories. It's not, we can't speak of it on kind of this federal level, but there are these really big trends among states. So as I mentioned earlier, there are 11 states in which homeschooling is entirely deregulated to the point that, a caregiver does not even have to notify the state that they're homeschooling, which can make it actually really challenging in situations of truancy in those states. And there's some excellent reporting from ProPublica on that in Illinois, one of the states in that category, where, families were being approached by, truancy officers, like their children hadn't been coming to school. They would just say, oh, I'm homeschooling. And kind of by declaration, they are legally homeschooling. There is not even a page of paperwork that they need to do in order to be legally homeschooling. That's 11 states. And then there are 18 on top of that, that kind of the only requirement in place is for parents to make that notification. But beyond that, as far as, reliably tracking any kind of educational progress, that's really not there. There are really only 2 states that universally ensure that every single child receives some form of assessment. And by assessment, we don't just mean standardized tests. As you've said, and as we've been talking about, homeschooling accommodates kind of different ways of teaching, different pedagogies, and sometimes a standardized test won't capture that as well as like a portfolio will do, or something a little bit more creative. But it's only really New York and Hawaii that universally ensure that every child, somebody's checking in as far as progress goes. So it's really deregulated. So if you think about disability, and a child who has additional needs on top of just regular curricular needs, that is a pretty unregulated environment. Of course, parents step up, they do. Responsible homeschooling families will go above and beyond whatever their, state, regulation tells them to do. And they will often, seek out resources. And there's kind of a variety in states in terms of what the state offers, how many public school resources disabled children or families with disabled children can access. But yeah, no, as far as the oversight perspective, it's really quite lax kind of across the United States.
Okay. What are some unique patterns, concerns that are associated with abuse and neglected children
Yeah.
who are homeschooled?
Yeah, so this is probably a good point to introduce our Homeschooling's Invisible Database project. I'm the kind of lead on that project, and we've been maintaining this database since 2013. And what HIC does is it tracks and analyzes publicly documented incidents of abuse and neglect in homeschooling environments. The reason why we do publicly documented incidents, so these are incidents that, they make the media, they're in public court proceedings, things like that, is because agencies don't systematically report any data on school status. You might get a case file from, a social worker, CPS that, mentions school, but there's nothing kind of in the aggregate that we can look at on the whole and actually make those comparisons. So one of our best data sources that is actually just going into the public record and, looking at those cases. And that's what we've done. And we've looked to date at about 500 cases, predominantly taking place since the year 2000. And tragically, among those cases, there's well over 200 fatalities from abuse and neglect in these homeschool settings. And there's a lot of trends, and I really am excited to kind of dig into, this really important information. But one that stands out and one that has a very direct relationship to policy is the fact that we see a very clear kind of fact pattern among some of our most severe cases. And that is families whose children aren't originally homeschooled. They're not K through 12. They're making the choice to homeschool later on. They're families withdrawing their child from school to homeschool either directly after a social services investigation into the family or actually even during an investigation. And that is legal in all 50 states. So I'm talking to you, you're in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is actually one of the best states as far as homeschool oversight is concerned. There's a lot there in terms of preventing educational neglect. Still not enough from our perspective, but definitely, far head and shoulders above a lot of other states. And also Pennsylvania is only one of 3 states. There's only 3 states that explicitly bar households from homeschooling if somebody in the household is convicted of a violent crime or a crime against a child. In 47 states, that provision is not there. Pennsylvania is one of those 3. But Pennsylvania is among all 50 states which allow a family to withdraw their child from school to homeschool, even if a social services investigation is live or active or recent. And we see devastation in those cases. I ran the numbers on that. We see statistically significantly higher numbers of, risk factors like prior social service, engagement. I mean, that's basically by definition, these are cases that involve social services. We see higher fatality and we see higher incidences of very, very severe abuse. And that is all tied to that withdrawal from school to homeschool under suspicious circumstances. That is the red flag. That is very central in our work, and it is something that is currently legal in all 50 states.
Now, Dr. Jonah, you said something a little while back as far as like the abuse and neglect can actually lead to death of a child. Besides that, how was it discovered that a homeschooled child is being abused? You know what I mean? Because their parents probably don't let them out much. So besides, and that's horrible. You know what I mean? That it
Right.
would lead to death, and I'm sure those statistics are there and horrible. But how else, or what other signs or red flags could someone notice to be able to help that child? Because I don't imagine they let them out much. Would it be a doctor's appointment? How would we help a child that's homeschooled, that's neglected or abused?
That is a really, really good question, and one for which there's not always very clear answers. I would love to tell you here are 5 surefire strategies. But you're right, when, social isolation is not only severe but deliberate, that family is retracting themselves, they're isolating intentionally in order to hide abuse. There are no requirements that that child come into contact with anybody. We have cases in our database in which neighbors didn't even know that the victim existed. The victim was, kept in a room, not allowed to go outside, and the neighbors did not even know there was a child being abused in that home. So this is what we're up against, and it is really difficult. We believe it, my organization, that obviously we have to, institute some policy changes in order to make it such that these kids have, it's mandated that they have some kind of access. And, that can take a lot of forms. I will say in terms of what we see in these cases, how they get discovered, it's very rare that, relatively speaking, among these cases that they come to light through a report. And when it is a report, it's almost always somebody who's in proximity to the child. So a neighbor, a family member, sometimes even a parent who, isn't the perpetrator, who is kind of, reporting the abuse of themselves as well, domestic violence being a big trend in these cases. But it's not professionals. Professionals are not getting their eyes on these children. But what I can say is, it is people in the community who do have the best bet often of encountering these children, and something that's so essential. Something about these cases is they're very extreme. They are real and they demand, I believe they present, an urgent problem that we need to address. And, they are on that extreme end. There are going to be situations that our database doesn't capture, and that's probably the majority of cases that are not as severe. Things are still going wrong in the home. Maybe there's educational neglect going on. There's abuse that, takes on less, what we would call extreme forms. I don't want to compare different kinds of abuse, what's worse or what's, or anything like that. But, abuse that's a little more subtle. And sometimes in those situations, what can make all the difference is an adult being in a child's life. If you're aware, in your community of a family that's kind of falling behind, and sometimes that's not even intentional. Sometimes it's just the family doesn't have access to, the resources they need to homeschool, right? Or, to adequately kind of support themselves. Being a presence in a child's life is huge. We have some resources on our site as far as especially the educational side, the educational neglect side of things, ways to encourage a child who might not be receiving an education at home, ways to encourage them as a learner, ways to like tell them that they're smart and capable and, give them access to resources. But yeah, you're right. In these situations of very severe abuse and neglect, it's really challenging. What we do with our training program is we equip professionals with knowledge of kind of the risk factors and patterns and red flags so that when they do get that rare encounter with these families, they can immediately identify it. That's kind of our goal. But yeah, on the front end and making sure that, these families do have some access to the outside world, that's really challenging. And yeah, not an easy question.
Now, your agency works throughout the United States?
Yeah, we do. We're based, we're incorporated in Massachusetts, but we work kind of nationwide. Of course, we have to can't do all 50 at once as much as we would
Right.
love to. We're active currently in Illinois. We've been active in Virginia, and a couple other states where, legislation is coming up and we're trying to push legislation. But yeah, our purview is technically the scope is all 50 because right now, all 50 states, that there's these loopholes that we're really trying to close.
Now, tell me in situations when someone would need to contact your agency.
Yeah, no, we have, and I'm happy to provide that information. We have an email line and a phone line, and we do encourage, if professionals, people working with children, educators, social workers, professionals like yourself who work with, children and families, if they come across a case that involves homeschooling and they want, some special kind of like expertise from us, that's something that we are more than happy to kind of provide. We know that it's a really challenging issue, and we love to help people problem solve around that. We also we're trying to kind of amass a network of people who are homeschooled themselves. Some people who are homeschooled identify as homeschool survivors. Of course, that's not everybody. There are people who had, again, really great experiences, but people in that survivor space, we encourage them to get in touch, share their stories. We have opportunities as far as, advocacy and people sharing their testimonies. But yeah, no, in addition to getting in contact with us directly, we do have on our site, we have a lot of resources as far as, signs of abuse and neglect, thinking about educational neglect as well. What are some signs of that we can identify, both as professionals and the public?
Dr.
Yeah,
Jonah, please share the website and the phone number for our viewers.
absolutely. So our website is responsiblehomeschooling.org. You can also get there via crhe.org if that's a little bit faster. And our email is info, so info at responsiblehomeschooling.org. And the phone number is also listed on our site, but it is 617-756-7096.
I thank you so much, and I thank you for this information that was very, very interesting and helpful. Thank you so much, Dr. Jonah.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for joining me today. Homeschooling is great. I enjoyed homeschooling my two babies. We had a blast, but they did go to school, and one of them had a great experience, the other one not so great. And then I homeschooled him again in 11th and 12th grade. But it's important for us to make sure that children are taken care of the way they need to be taken care of. And no child should ever have to suffer any neglect or abuse. Peace and love.